This conference will now be recorded.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. This is our Trauma Data Analyst group, kind of a subgroup of the Trauma Manager Council for NASEMSO. And so there's a lot of names on here that I don't necessarily know, but I know that you all work with trauma data in some form or fashion. And so our two speakers today are two groups of speakers. Both worked with some trauma data to have really two great projects. And I found Dr. Corinne Picasa, she goes by Corey, actually, I think through the Washington report that was released, or maybe it was ATS. One of those emails came out and I was clicking through and I saw this an article related to this project or this research and was really interested because living in Montana, I really key in on trauma, rural, farmer, rancher. It's kind of our world. And so I read this and was really just interested to see how the trauma data was used in this research. So I invited her to speak with us today. And then we have a second group that will go a little bit later after she's done, and I'll introduce them at that time. But I'll turn it over to you, Corey. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So let me just ask, is the sound and visuals, everything okay? Someone can give me a thumbs up. Okay, great. So listen, I did just want to mention quickly that I am working with Montana State University doing a Department of Transportation project on rural roadway safety, and it's a national project coming up with a rural road safety toolkit. And I wanted to mention it because there's often a little bit of a disconnect between work going on in departments of transportation and the work going on in public health, and then also sometimes in public safety. So happy to share more information about that project if you're interested.
Absolutely, that sounds great. Yeah, I know they do a lot with the rural roadway, so.
Yeah. So this project was really kind of a culmination of interest from the Iowa Injury Prevention Research Center, which is funded by the CDC, and also the Great Plains Center for Agricultural Safety and Health. And we share an interest in reducing agricultural and rural related trauma. And also we worked with a student who was funded through our Heartland Center for Occupational Safety and Health. So just want to give credit to those different centers that all helped this come to fruition. So let me start by just saying a little bit about Iowa's trauma system. I know there are people from all over, and you look at one state and you've seen one trauma system. And I think Iowa has a very good system that meets the needs of our rural residents pretty well. So our trauma system was established with a study bill in 1995, so quite a while ago now, before I lived in Iowa even, the Iowa Trauma Care Development Act. And this was a year-long study bill to identify where should it sit, and it was decided that it would sit in the Iowa Department of Public Health. And what were the advisory bodies? So at that time, there was a Trauma System Advisory Council, and there was a System Quality and Improvement, and those were kept separate, so the group doing the evaluation was different than the groups making decisions. Those have been changed a little bit because you guys probably have also experienced some scrutiny over advisory bodies within state agencies, trying to minimize the number of different advisory bodies. At the time this was started, the Iowa Injury Prevention Center, which I started directing in 2006, was the evaluation body for the trauma system. Now it's been really nice that we've turned that back over to the Iowa Department of Public Health because they have the capacity to do their own evaluation. So it's nice to see that has grown. So after the study bill, the Trauma Act was implemented in 1996, and it required implementation to be complete by 2001 that included standards for trauma care, standardized triage and transfer protocols for EMS across the state, and then for inter-hospital transfers. It established a trauma registry, and I'm going to talk for just a second about that now because that's how we did this project. The trauma registry involved mandatory data from all level 1, 2, and 3 hospitals, and I'll talk about hospital verification as well. For any trauma that met trauma criteria, which meant they engaged and had a need for the standardized transfer protocols. And then there was voluntary participation by our level 4 hospitals. So the registry is not population based, but it does cover all of the major traumas in Iowa, because going to a level 4 hospital would require you to be transferred to at least a level 3 if you met trauma criteria. So the bill also required trauma care education and training, so that even in critical care access hospitals, at least someone in the emergency unit had to have, everyone had to have basic life support, and some had advanced life support training. And it also involved procedures for verification. So every hospital that provides emergency care in Iowa is required to be verified. And so here's a map of what our verification looks like. We have a lot of critical access hospitals that are level 4s, and those are the blue ones. So you can see it's, you know, not that hard to get to a level 4 hospital if you need care. So we have a high volume of hospitals, but we also don't have in our rural environment the same remoteness that many states have. So, you know, places in Maine and Alaska that could only be accessed by boat. Some of the mountainous regions are a challenge in areas like Montana. I grew up in northern New Mexico. Oh, yeah, we had a lot of skiing trauma, and sometimes evacuating those injuries was a little bit of a challenge because the roads weren't in great condition. They are incredibly steep and difficult to get around. So one thing I do want to say is that the verification in Iowa follows the American College of Surgeons, and that verification standard, as you all are probably well aware, has increased over time. So red are the level 1 trauma centers, and it looks like we only have one level 1 trauma center, and it's true, we only have one verified at level 1 status. But the green hospital, that's a level 2, provides care at the same level as the red one, because the standards have required a lot more things related to research and community involvement and service, not necessarily changing the level of care. So I think that Iowa, when you look at this map, seems a little under-resourced for care compared to what we actually are able to provide. I think that there are a number of the level 3s also functionally almost 24 hours a day, but maybe not all 24 hours of the day, operate as level 2s as far as the care that they're able to provide, which I think is probably something you're used to seeing in your states too. So let me now get into the specific project. This kind of started in a you know, research often starts in a fairly random way. Our governor had made kind of just an offhand comment about rural emergency medical services being volunteer, and then kind of implying that that means they're not very good. In fact, that's pretty much what the governor had said at that time, and I don't think it was a intentionally meant slight, but it came off that way and the press picked it up. So in Iowa, 80% of our emergency medical care providers are volunteers. They have the same training as the paid ones, and they're really exceptionally good and devoted. And we wanted some information to try to refute that and get some positive press for our volunteer providers as well as our paid providers. But it also was this intersection of interest in reducing mortality from especially agricultural injuries. So one of the things that we know is that time to definitive care delays survival likelihood based on the probability of death from the severity of injury. So we decided to look, what we wanted to do was look at time to care for agricultural injuries. And so of course, in most studies, you know who you're interested in, but to make interpretation of what that means, you have to figure out who you want to compare that to. And that's usually the trickier part of a research question. So we decided there's, you know, we don't necessarily want to compare agricultural injuries with, like, for example, a fall of an older person alone in their home. So we wanted to compare it more to, you know, work to work, even though agricultural injuries happen in a lot of different ways. And then we also, since we're looking at time to definitive care, we didn't want to compare apples to oranges and compare a lot of urban injuries to rural injuries. So the comparison group were other rural occupational injuries. Now we were able to do this only because we collect some fairly unique variables in our trauma system. And that happened because the injury center was the one who developed the code book. So we have two variables that allowed this. One is a work-related variable. So independently of who pays, so it doesn't have to be workers' comp. And, you know, just as an aside, we did look at the payer source for agricultural injuries, and only 18% were covered by workers' compensation, because most farmers will use property insurance or other types of insurance to cover their traumatic injuries. So we have a designation of whether or not the injury is work-related based on how the injury happened in the activities. And then we also have a separate independent designation for whether or not it was farm-related, because many farm or agriculture-related injuries might occur on the farm home. So we were able to pick out both those that were work-related and those that were farm-related or agriculture-related. So we wanted to identify if there was a delay in definitive care, and if there was, when in the process did that delay occur? Was it because rural EMS providers are spending a lot longer at the scene, or they don't deliver the patient to the right definitive care hospital? So to answer that question, it really needs a lot of detailed data that is hard to pull out of a trauma system. We divided the trauma response into these intervals, which are the discovery interval. That's the time between when the physical energy is absorbed and the injury occurs to the individual, and when someone knows about it, so EMS being dispatched. And so you can imagine areas of things like a tractor rollover, where the farmer might be alone in the field and might have reasons that the farmer is not able to contact EMS. So the response interval is the time between EMS dispatch and arrival at the scene. And we do know that is challenged in rural environments because the distance is longer, and sometimes the on-call team is not sitting at the station at the time they're on call, so they need to get to the ambulance. We have the on-scene interval, which is the time that EMS arrives at parts. So that, there's a lot that you have to decide. Are you gonna, what airway management do you need? What kind of C-spine protections do you need? So there's a lot of training in how to minimize the time on the scene while still providing optimal support that the patient needs. And then finally, the EMS depart to arrival at the hospital, and that also includes transfer from one level to another level hospital. So we had to combine a lot of years of data to look at this question, just because by the time you filter it down to occupational and farm and non-farm and rural, the numbers get fairly small. So we looked at our registry from 2005 to 2011. We found 6,392 occupational injuries. So those were injuries in which the work designation was positive. And then we went through this flow chart to figure out who we could include. And that involved a lot of different variables. We don't have to go into this in detail, but it required us having enough data that we could at least figure out what time to definitive care was. So we ended up excluding, more than a third, just over a third, or maybe under, of cases because of those challenges. But we ended up with 4,000, which for an agricultural occupational study is a pretty nice sample size. And those we were able to divide into 855 in which the farm designation was positive, and 3,166 rural occupational injuries, but not related to agriculture. So then we further had to exclude cases because we couldn't divide out all those little pieces of the trauma response. So that required getting the full spectrum of injury to time of care, definitive care, with all the little pieces required linking to emergency medical services. And I don't know how many of you have done that. I think we were maybe the first ones in Iowa to try that, and it's really kind of messy. EMS data was really kind of messy. The link was really kind of messy, but I think we did a good job with it. I mean, EMS is just messy. It's not that the data that's provided is not well done by the agencies. It's just messy data. So in order to get all those times, we ended up excluding quite a few more, and we ended up, for that detailed analysis, with 159 ag injuries and 1,269 non-ag work injuries in rural areas. Actually, we hadn't done the rural subsetting at that point, so those are all across the state. So here, you guys all know this, working with trauma data, messy, messy, messy. But we did end up with a lot, we have good quality management of the system. So we had a much more challenging time with inconsistency and unknown than with things just not being filled out completely. So here are some characteristics of farm and non-farm occupational injuries. We ended up identifying that, you know, Iowa is farmland. So especially as we have sort of an increasing intersection of towns with farming operations, we decided we wanted to look at rurality rather than just exclude on rurality. So I'll draw your attention to this. Unfortunately, I have to move my screen so I can't see the thing. Give me just a second. Okay, so we're looking at farm work related and non-farm. This should not say rural, it's non-farm work related injuries. So when we look at rurality, we do still see a proportion of those injuries are farm related, even in urban geographic areas. And we coded rural and urban based on rural-urban influence codes. So that gives 10 codes. Iowa does not have the metropolitan code, but then everything else can be divided based on standard guidelines into urban, large town, small town, and isolated rural. So it's not a surprise that, you know, almost half of the farming injuries were in isolated rural, but we still see the other half in mostly small and large towns, but also in urban areas we have farm operations going on. So, you know, this is not highly unexpected. Again, we can see workers' comp was not all that common a payer for the farm injuries. They're not really a common payer for a lot of agricultural or for a lot of work-related injuries either. Let's see, most of the injuries were blunt, a lot of fractures, some brain injuries, spinal cord injuries, etc. And spinal and yeah, looks a little high, but I'll have to check that. Okay, so let's now look at, oops, answering the question about increasing rurality and increasing longer times to definitive care, separated by what we looked at were, so we wanted to separate those patients that came by EMS and those that came by other methods, which are almost all, in our instance, private vehicle. And because really, if we're going to reduce time to definitive care, we're going to have more opportunity to do that with the EMS transfers or pick up in the field. Really more difficult to do that when someone is brought in by a private vehicle. So these are hazard models. And basically, to read these, just the earlier rise in the line indicates a quicker time to definitive care. So among the quickest times were the farm non-EMS, which is interesting, but not all that surprising, because these are injuries where someone probably witnessed the injury, scooped the person up, and brought them to the hospital right away. And we see that the farm and non-farm look fairly similar in rural areas, but in metropolitan areas, we see more difference between the dotted lines, which are EMS, and the solid lines, or dotted lines. Dotted lines are non-farm, EMS are non-EMS. I'm sorry, we have to look at this for a second. So let's go back to rural, and so we see that the non-EMS, which are the blue, have the higher line, and then the EMS are a little shorter, but we do see some differentiation in the non-farm EMS having a higher rise than the farm EMS. So if we look at this overall, we see that really in each of these areas, small town, micropolitan, metropolitan, which is actually urban, the lowest rise is among the farm EMS. So they are the ones that have the longest or the biggest delays in reaching definitive care. So we also, knowing that we are focused on the golden hour, we were interested in looking between non-farm and farm overall, not by rurality segregation, censored at 4 hours for severe injury. So these are the ones where the probability of survival is is not guaranteed. There's a high probability of death. And here we see the same thing, that the non-farm have a higher rise. So if we look at sort of 1 hour, we see that maybe this would be about 30% of the non-farm have arrived at definitive care, but among the farmers, the dark line, we see that's really closer to 10%. So this graph, it's not dividing by rurality shows a pretty big separation between probability of reaching time to care at different intervals. So looking at hazard ratios, comparing probability of reaching care within each time window. Doing this again. Hold on just a minute. Depending on where I put my panel of people, I see different parts of my slide. Okay, so for 1 hour and under, we see that for severe injuries, overall, there's a significant reduction in the likelihood of receiving care in an hour, being a definitive care in under an hour. And we see that that is much more the case for EMS users at the very far end. I don't have a pointer and don't know how to make my mouse work over on that screen. So the EMS users are at the far level, and we see that there's a pretty significant change within the 1 hour. But after that, there was less of a difference. So individuals with severe farm injuries were less likely to reach definitive care within 1 hour. And this difference was significant only for EMS users because the non-EMS users, again, are kind of in that scoop and run model. And after 1 hour, the probability of reaching care in each window did not differ that much between farm and non-farm injuries. So that indicates, yes, there is a delay. The delay is within that golden hour, but not much after that. But we don't from this know which period is most likely leading to the delay. So now we want to go a little bit deeper and not just examine pre-hospital to definitive care, but look at these different states, moving between discovery, response, scene, and transport. So if there are any data nerds, this was a really interesting and fun model to build. And basically what we used was a hazard transition model. So we were looking at probability, time-dependent probability of moving forward in each of these states. And the challenge from a modeling standpoint is they're all dependent on each other. So you can't just look at each as an independent, because if one's delayed, all the others will be delayed after that. So we wanted to take that into account and control for it. So when we did that, let's see, we can look at just the median times for each of these intervals. And so here we're comparing farm in the right column, left column, and non-farm in the right column. And we have the median time and the interquartile range for each of those. And we do see farm compared to non-farm just for the medians, that other than the scene interval, there were delays in farm compared to non-farm in just looking at the p-value. So that we see, I don't know why I can't make my cursor work over here, but we see the overall time to definitive care among the farmers was 77 minutes. Median time for non-farmers was 50 minutes. And then going down at discovery interval, response interval, scene interval, and transport interval, they're higher except for scene interval. And that was actually a nice one to have be the same. So we can say no matter if you're farm, non-farm, the EMS providers are spending the amount of time at the scene that's the same. And then we looked at those that were transferred from one hospital to another hospital and found that the delay wasn't from the need for inter-hospital transfer. It was more between those that were not transferred. So the delay is not getting from one hospital to another. It's getting from your scene to immediate definitive care. States that don't have consistent protocols in triage and transfer might not see this. Because there might be a more likely transfer of a severely injured patient to a level 4 hospital rather than directly to a level 1 if there's not need for stabilization. Okay. So looking at the hazard ratios where it's better to be lower, and comparing both farmer and then also by severity, we see that these differences were statistically significant, moving from discovery to response, from response to scene, not from scene to transport, but then finally from transport to definitive care. That's what I'm showing here. And I'm going to wrap up soon, so just to put that in words. Compared to non-farmers experiencing occupational injuries, injured farmers waited longer for the ambulance to be dispatched for the ambulance to arrive at the scene and once in the ambulance to reach their final hospital destination, but did not experience a longer time with EMS at the scene. So the results appear to agree with those from what we saw in the median table, indicating that farmers are more likely to spend a longer amount of time in those phases that actually have longer distance and maybe more likely to have injuries that are not witnessed, so it takes longer to, or that there's a long way to go because you might not have cell phone coverage, a longer way to go to discover the injury by reporting it to EMS. Okay, so that is it in summary, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I can try to stop sharing my screen, but I'm not super used to this software, so I'm not sure what buttons to push.
Kathy might be able to pull that back. Well, that was
I found it. Yay.
very interesting. I mean, it definitely reiterates, I think those of us that live in a rural state already kind of knew this anecdotally at least, that our farmers and ranchers do lie in the field if it's an unwitnessed injury. They are lying there, and we do see a lot more private vehicle arrivals in our smaller critical access hospitals and in our ranching communities. We definitely see that, and I know our hospitals struggle to try to get that information out to use EMS as much as possible. But what questions does anyone have for Corey? So I know for me, so the non-farm related is more like motor vehicle crash or anything that's just not agricultural coded.
And that would be, it was work, so it would be a lot of transport just because a lot of transport is work related, but it also would involve construction, I don't know, whatever industry is going on in rural areas. We know that construction is differentially high in injury risk in even, I mean, overall, but also in rural construction compared to urban construction.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. That was great information, and I love to see our registry data getting used for, proving what we already see on the front lines in the hospitals. So thank you so much for taking time to present that information to us today.
My pleasure, absolutely. I need to sign off, but I'm happy to answer any questions by email or however you can track me down.
All right. Yeah, we'll make sure that if anyone has any, we'll pass those along to you.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Corey. All right, our second set of speakers actually comes to us from Georgia, and this Stephanie and Luke will be presenting to us how they utilize the state trauma registry for injury prevention activities related to pedestrian versus auto accidents. And I kind of came across this one. Stephanie presented on an injury prevention panel for the American Trauma Society, and I kind of was really interested in, again, in how our trauma registry data is being used to get information out to the public. So I'll let Luke and Stephanie take over.
Good morning, everyone.
Hey there. So my name is Stephanie Gendron, and this is Luke Colony, and we'll give you a little bit of background as we continue through the presentation. This presentation has been kind of a labor of love for us, labor being the key component there. So we will just go ahead and get right through it. Okay.
I got it.
Okay, perfect. So my position is that I am a regional trauma coordinator, and I work under the Georgia Trauma Care Network Commission, which is also just called the Georgia Trauma Commission. We were funded through Senate Bill 60, so it sounds like we're set up a little bit similarly to the last presenter. Our agency has been around since 2007, and they started with the regional trauma coordinators about 4 or 5 years ago. Our state is split up into 10 different trauma regions, and my region that I am responsible for is the southeastern part, which is basically Savannah, for those of you who know Georgia a little. And so that is my role, and I will let Luke explain his.
So I'm Luke Culleney. I am the IT administrator for Chatham Emergency Services. We are the fire provider for all of unincorporated Chatham County. We cover about 30,000 homes in the area. Additionally, we're the EMS provider, the sole EMS provider for 911 response within Chatham County, where Savannah lies. We run on average about 75,000 calls a year, resulting in around 40 to 45,000 transports a year. I got to know Stephanie through our EMS chief. He came to me as the IT administrator. He needed some data pulled from our systems regarding vehicle versus pedestrian incidents, and Stephanie was trying to compile this data for the trauma registry, and that's how this labor, I lean more towards the labor side as well, began. I am a firefighter paramedic, so that's where I started before becoming into the IT side. So when Corey talks about the messy data, that's me. But part of my job as the IT administrator for the department is to help clean up that messy data, to get our crew members to answer questions the way that they're meant to be answered, and to help when we need to extract things, the data that we can pull out is only as good as the data we put in. So working with Stephanie on this project has opened up a lot of potential over the course of discussions of how we can better get our crew members answered questions in our EPCR forms and get hospital data prepared, so that when we turn it over for research projects, that everything's kind of in a ready state. So without further ado, a little bit more about the contributors.
So we initially had the idea for this program while I was hospital based, and our injury prevention coordinator position was vacant. And so we were going through our consultative visit with ACS, and we really needed to catch up on some injury prevention projects. And myself and one of the registrars realized that there was a large uptick in pedestrian-related incidents in our area. So we did an initial poll of just registry data. It was very rough, and we noticed a pattern with it. From there, we decided to go down the long path of getting IRB approval. And so these are the other kind of 3 people that were very essential to the program. And so that's something we'll talk about a little bit. We have a GQIP program that is very strong for the state. And Kara Allard was our contact with that. She is now working out of Boston. So she is not with GQIP anymore, but I still regularly call her all the time for questions about this. Our lead registrar that worked with us from Memorial Health, and then Captain Michael Vandercook, and you kind of, it seems like a weird person to be involved in this, but he was ultimately the one who helped tie a lot of this data together. So we started working on this project. I actually happened to meet Luke in a class, and I was like, I need you to help me do this. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is the relationship of EMS data and registry data. We'll just go through the background. Traffic crashes are considered to be a leading cause of death. For most of your registries and your centers, you're going to have that as one of your top 3. I think that's a pretty consistent incident regarding for trauma centers nationally. Our trauma center in Savannah is known as a rural trauma center because regardless of Savannah being urban, we service about 24 counties that are rural surrounding us. And then the area to the west is even more rural than that. So when we're talking about those farm-related injuries, the further away we go from Savannah, we see a lot of those. A significant portion of those deaths arise from crashes involving pedestrians, and there are 400,000 pedestrians killed globally each year. And in recent years, we have noticed that those numbers have been escalating nationally and internationally. There was more than a 3% increase in the number of pedestrians killed in traffic crashes in 2018. This has been the most deaths since 1990. We looked at a lot of NHTSA reports. Most of those occurred in urban settings, on open roads and in intersections and at night. We have a little bit of data that did conflict with the night component, and we will talk about what is interesting with Savannah and times. The largest number of pedestrian deaths are on Saturdays, and again, those also happen on night and Saturdays. And on average, every 88 minutes, a pedestrian was killed. So you will see a comparison for Georgia traffic fatalities, pedestrian fatalities, percentage, and then percentage per 100,000. So we are above the US total, and states differ widely. So obviously you're going to have different patterns in Vermont as we are in Georgia. But in Georgia was one of the top 5, including Arizona, California, Florida, and Texas, that accounted for half of pedestrian deaths nationally.
Big number.
That's a big number.
Big numbers. 5 states accounts for 47% of the U.S. deaths. I think part of what this project addresses and what we've worked so hard to try to identify is you've seen so many advancements in a relative decline in the number of fatalities related from vehicle versus vehicle due to safety enhancements in the vehicles and airbags, seat belts, all that. But there's so little that you can do when it comes to pedestrian versus vehicle as far as on the automotive side. It's still cars and people don't match. So a lot of the statistics that you see as they continue to climb and others continue to decline, you try to figure out how can technology play a role in reducing these accidents.
And for pedestrian incidents, we've also seen that technology has increased our incidents because of texting and walking. Who knew? So we found 260 pedestrian fatalities in Georgia in 2017, which was up greatly from 2016 and 2015. And all of this data we were collecting was from the Georgia Department of Transportation. So while we were collecting all this data, everything is related to fatalities. But we know that with trauma, we do not want fatalities. We want to save our patients. So we are having a really hard time collecting information and data about pedestrian injuries as opposed to fatalities. So that was kind of where our research headed next. So here was our aim as according to our IRB, we wanted to identify factors and hotspots resulting in motor vehicle crashes involving pedestrians. A hotspot for the purposes of the project was defined as an area that has been shown to have a significant amount of danger or activity. So our initial idea was to kind of heat map it out and use a mapping software to get a better visual of where this was happening. We wanted to include, as I said, most data is focused on fatalities. We wanted to include both incidents resulting in fatalities and incidents resulting in injuries. In addition, we also captured a few patients or a few incidents that resulted in no injuries. And in order to capture that full set of data, we needed to rely on our EMS data as opposed to our trauma registry. Because our trauma registry was not capturing, it was not even capturing, I would say, 80% of the data that we needed. So required resources that you will need is we needed the incident report data from EMS, police, fire, and hospitals participating in the county, region, or city that you're trying to study. We have 3 hospitals that are in Chatham County, and only one of those is a trauma center. But that does not mean that they did not have pedestrians being sent there. So we needed to be able to capture that, and the best way was using EMS data. You need a team member from each of these areas, and it says inconsistencies arise with the data generated. That was where you need the person from each agency, because there were many times when we had all of us on the phone trying to nail down a patient. For mapping software, our project primarily used Google Fusion tables. That was discontinued in 2019. ArcGIS is an alternative software, but you need to have great geocoding experience. And unfortunately, most trauma programs do not, but most EMS departments do.
Mapping's kind of our thing. Going on to a little bit further of the inconsistencies with data generated, a lot of what we'll talk about kind of compounds what Corey was saying in her presentation. the data that we put into our systems, messy is one word. The 90% of what our validation rules and things that go into helping our users fill out our PCRs are for the 5% of the employees. They can't seem to do things the way that we need them to. So for the vast majority, people are very good at charting, in our agency, but getting the data to mesh up with trauma registry data and with patient records is a whole nother animal, because there is no common denominator that carries through, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But time to care metrics that Corey's doing, that's a project that we've been trying to tackle, as well as how do we take information from our PCR data, match it up to a patient's intake records at a first hospital, transfer it to a second hospital. And it is quite a beast when you're trying to put that kind of data together. ArcGIS, as Stephanie had said, is it's an online platform. It's not as bad as it seems as far as learning the software, but there is so much potential that you can do. If you guys have looked at any of the coronavirus maps and looking at where the spread has gone, the Johns Hopkins ones, that's all ArcGIS mapping. So you can start with a very basic rudimentary heat maps and then take it into drilling into your data and metrics via gender, age, time of day, severity of the injury, and drill down into that. So the Google Fusion, while it was a good start for us, a couple of years ago, there's so much more that we can do now with ArcGIS.
So for our data collection, we took retrospective data through the GQuick program through 2014 through 2018. We did decide to exclude skateboards, bicycles, any type of scooter, that sort of thing. We do not have the electric scooters like Atlanta does. We just thought that really changed the direction of our study. We did take out intentional hits. There were a few of those. And intentional or incidents on private property. So if someone, if they had backed over someone in their driveway, we just didn't feel like that was capturing the true traffic engineering, injury prevention direction that we wanted to go. So on your, go back, that is going to be the map of the county that we studied. So you'll see kind of in the middle where we hit Savannah, and then it does get a little bit more rural the further out you go.
So data elements. This comes back to from an EMS standpoint. Stephanie pointed out, where do you start with a project like this? Do you start with hospital intake records? Do you start with registry data, trauma registry data, because there's patients that go to the hospital and are transported that may never get into the registry because they weren't severe enough. There's patients that get transported to other hospitals, Memorial, Candler, St. Joseph's. We're focusing primarily on the data from Memorial because that's where the trauma registry links in. But overall, do you start with police records, which may or may not include patient, pertinent information? So we decided to start with the EMS data and use that as a starting point, and then try to link up as much as we could throughout the hospital network. So intake records for the patient and trauma registry data for the outcome and how their injuries were. So trying to figure out what information is needed. This report originally started with about 10 to 12 fields when Stephanie originally came to us. And as we started to try to figure out how we were going to capture every specific incident, we had to think about how every crew member could document this. So that involves a lot more data. As you can see, we got into close to 30 fields in the end result of the data that we pulled. But we needed to look at things like complaint reported by dispatch. So what were the crews sent to? They were sent to a vehicle versus pedestrian. Very easy. We know that there was probably a vehicle and there was probably a pedestrian. That was the kind of data we were looking for. Coincidentally, a lot of times when people call in an emergency, it just calls in as a motor vehicle collision. So we don't necessarily know that it was a vehicle versus pedestrian. It came in as a motor vehicle collision or two vehicles, and then a pedestrian was involved, maybe on a bicycle, something along those lines. Trying to weed out the data into just the core components that we were looking for. So that involved us getting a little bit further into it, and you'll see in the middle of the screen, we started pulling in the primary impression and secondary impression. So trying to figure out what happened to that patient, vehicle versus pedestrian, and they smacked the car and hurt their hand. Not really, not something that we were looking to capture. So looking at what our paramedics in the field identified as their impression of what happened. So we had to query those two fields. Additionally, We queried the e-injury field, so trying to figure out the cause of injury. So the cause of injury code list and description list. There's some very specific codes that crew members could choose from when they select that a patient has been injured. Ask them how they were injured. So trying to query those specific codes. We did filters on our narratives to determine vehicle versus pedestrian. We put in keywords that crew members may include in their narratives when they're typing, anything that could possibly capture things into our data set. And then we had to vet all of that data, which Stephanie will talk a little bit more about here in a moment. But these are the fields that we felt were important. We wanted to know where people were from. We wanted to know how old they were, whether they were male or female. We needed to know the time that the incident occurred, the time that they got to the hospital, how severe their injuries were, really any demographic that we could use to build a better picture of who's getting injured in Savannah. Is it tourists? Is it locals? Are they male? Are they female? Are they kids? Are they adults? This is a little bit of, we use, I should have probably covered earlier, at Chatham, we use Image Trend as our ePCR data solution. So we have, this is our records management, and Image Trend is also what the state of Georgia uses. We have our own standalone site. So we'll put information into our system, it'll export to the state system. So we could technically pull this data from our Chatham EMS site or from our agency site on the state side as well. That was an important component to when we were trying to pull back historical data for previous years, because we made a transition in 2018 to be using Image Trend Elite on a NASEMSO 3 platform. And in order to pull anything older than that, I had to go to the state site and be able to access our old NASEMSO 2 records. So it involved kind of rebuilding this report and trying to extract data from the old NASEMSO set, which was a bit difficult to match up at times with the newest versions. But essentially pick list, selecting all of the fields that we're trying to query, and then lumping in the criteria to filter out all the noise, if you will, all the calls that aren't pertinent, and pull in all the ones that are involving vehicles and pedestrians. So this is a little bit about what I already talked about, but if you're dispatched to a motor vehicle collision versus pedestrian, but you arrive to only find an MVC, we need to weed that out. That's why dispatch complaint doesn't work in and of itself. We need to have other fields that we're querying with. Similarly, if you're dispatched to an MVC and you find a pedestrian versus MVC, and then as I talked about the mechanism of injury, primary impression, all that. So Image Trend does have a built-in platform when you run your reports from Report Writer. They have a tool that you can use where you can generate a map based off of that data. So right from within Image Trend you run, you get 600 records. You can go up to the top and hit export, and it generates a map for you, either as a point plot or as a heat map. So that gave us a pretty good idea right off the get-go of what things were looking like, where these incidents were occurring just from our data set. Not even looking at the trauma data from Memorial Hospital and the registry.
All right, so then once we ran that report, we decided we were ready to run the registry report. These were really the main elements that we looked at for our patients. We wanted to know firstly if they were a trauma patient, yes or no. Transport method, I think 95% of these were via EMS. We did find a few that were either self-transport, and I think we had one that was air transport, which was probably due to traffic issues. Their outcome, ISS, hospital days, discharge disposition, activation level, and then alcohol and drug results. It is important, like we said, to start with the EMS data because every patient may not have a trauma record. So once we got the two reports, then we merged them. It sounds very easy, but we did not have an easy time merging them because especially with a lot of our patients that had a death outcome, their name, they may have come in with a trauma name and that name may not have been changed. They may not have full information on them, their address, that sort of thing.
So it posed a challenge, something that, prior to working with Stephanie and the trauma team hadn't really thought about. How do we link up this data on a per incident basis? Every ePCR that we do in the field, when we drop a patient off at the hospital, we're putting in their medical record number. But their medical record number is not specific to that instance. It's a number that stays with the patient throughout all their time. So if Luke got hit by a car 5 times, that's only one medical record number. So how do we take the data that for each individual run that we've done and match up to the specific intake for that specific patient for that specific instance? And that's a problem that to this day we're still working on trying to come up with a resolution. Part of that could help if the hospitals were able to input our incident number into their reports, then we could cross-reference the two. We could look up the patient's medical record number and match it to our incident number. And then furthermore, they would have to take that data into the registry environment when they're doing it to keep those numbers consistent. And that's something that we're working with our hospital partners to try to do for future instances.
And to go off of that, that works for us because we have one EMS system. But when you start having more than one EMS agency, it gets really messy. So joining data sources, this is all de-identified, but this is kind of what it looked like to us when we opened it up. There was no common identifier between all data sources. Even names were off, dates of birth were off, genders were off. We had repeat patients that were in. We had people, like Luke said, who got hit by a vehicle multiple times, unfortunately. And so this is where I said we went back to the fire department to assist us in matching patients. Our fire department in Savannah, the city of Savannah, does respond to these type of incidents. And while they do not fill out full transport reports, they were a great third source to kind of fall back on as we were combing through the data.
You'll find by and large that fire department records are a little bit cleaner than EMS. The fast pace, get on scene, grab a patient, take them to the hospital. As soon as you clear that hospital, that transport, you're getting dispatched on something else. That pace is part of what leads to those EMS records being so hard to track and being less complete, if you will, than some of the fire departments. So Savannah Fire Department and even our fire department were able to aid in the individual areas where those incidents occurred. They have a little more time to do the reports. They have a little bit more time on scene to break down what happened in the incident, and by and large, the documentation is just a bit cleaner.
And I will say one of the reasons that we did not fall back on police data is because there were a large number of these incidents that police do not actually get called to, which was very surprising to us. So here was kind of what our patient makeup looks like. We ended up having 524 incidents. You'll see our age range. So our biggest range was 16 to 30. Most of those were male. 90% of our patients had a GCS over 9, of which 98% were 14 or 15, so that's great. We had 6 repeat patients. Most of those patients either had alcohol or drugs involved or were homeless. We had 1 3-peat patient, one poor soul who got hit 3 times within a 3-year period, and we had 1 patient who got hit twice within a 2-week period in different locations. You will see the ages again, and then one thing that we really wanted to look at, and one of our hypotheses was that most people were going to be from outside of Savannah. Savannah is a huge tourism community. A lot of people come here to visit. We have a lot of parades, we have a lot of festivals, and we also have no open container law. Which means you can get a drink from a bar and take it to go, which you can imagine how that goes. So we thought that it was going to be a lot of tourists who did not know the city, who were walking and got hit by cars. However, that was a data element that we pulled. 84% of our patients resided in Georgia and 68% were local to Savannah. So that kind of went out the window. 55% of our incidents occurred between 2 p.m. and most of that focused around rush hours, so the hours of 4 to about 7 in Savannah, which is also the time when people start going to the bars. 18% of our patients were brought to the trauma center. Alcohol is a factor in 18% of our trauma patients. We did not get a great number on alcohol use for patients that were not trauma patients, and 90% of our patients ultimately lived. So that goes back to the other data about trauma, pedestrian fatalities. We really wanted to capture injuries and incidents, and that was why. Here is our time frames. You can see that again. We have that big jump between 2 and 10, and again, we think it's due to A, people leaving work, B, the alcohol, and dusk.
Darkness.
Continued results. We had 4 patients that had no injuries reported, so EMS was called and they had no transport, which leads us to ask if we are missing another subset of data for people who maybe just get bumped, or it does not get reported, or they talk about it and they're both fine and they leave. When you look at our average ISS, we did have, it's kind of spread out, but most people were okay. So that is good news. Our average length of stay for patients in the hospital for registry patients was 8 days. So this was our mapping process. This is all incidents on the map. You will see they mostly focus around that downtown area. Do you have a mouse over it?
Sure.
So if you kind of go down, there is a flow down, and that is the major kind of business throughway through Savannah. It is not pedestrian friendly. And then as you go further out to the right, you have Tybee Island, which is basically one street on an island that we had few incidents.
So this is that geocoding aspect that we talked about, taking an address and making it into a point on a map, latitude and longitude, to generate the point there. So this is data that from an EMS standpoint, we have readily available. Everything that somebody calls 911 gets put into our dispatch software, and that dispatch software maps it. That data is transferred into our EPR. So we're in a prime spot to have this information where a hospital system and the registry will have arrival data, and everything starts at the hospital. We may not know exactly where.
Okay, and then this was probably our most helpful map as far as injury prevention. This is going to be ISS greater than 10, GIS lower than 13. So these are our most dangerous intersections in the area. And you will see that they were all intersections. It is half residential and kind of half intersections downtown. We did go ahead and look at one of the intersections, and you will see that. So this is our most dangerous intersection at MLK and Ovalcorp. It is about 6 lanes on either side, and they are just crosswalks. So that said a lot to us.
This is also in a prime spot downtown for student traffic. Savannah College of Art and Design has its freshman and sophomore dorms about a block and a half away from this. And then if you're looking down the street, that's where the primary business district and the nightlife is. So one could say that our number of those metrics of the 60-year-old population, a large percentage of that could involve students from the college. Additionally, shortly after we completed this project, we had an incident actually right here on this street, just up the road, where 2 o'clock in the morning, gentleman was walking in dark clothes, ran across the street and got struck by a car coming from the oncoming lane in front of one of our ambulances, and the crews had to assist right in the street there. So it's just interesting to see when we look at where these incidents were occurring, and then to have one occur right in front of our ambulance. It was captured on the drive camera. It just shows that there's definitely a problem with, part of it is the street lighting. It was very hard to see even on the camera as it happened.
The next map that we found really helpful was incidents involving school-age children. So this was, I believe, children about 5 to 21. And as we heat mapped this, we said we have to be looking at specific things. So we looked at a map and we identified there are certain schools that they fall around. So as Luke said, Savannah College of Art and Design, we have a high school on the upper left, a high school on the right, a middle school, and ironically, our trauma center was a hotspot. We had 7 patients that were hit at the hospital. That is not good, depending on how you look at it. So basically, there are multiple opportunities for education and prevention. It's really important. What we realize is that the trauma system data is great, but you have to include other agencies to get the full picture. By working with EMS, police, fire, we could not have collected a full set. We did look at including the police data, but it gets a little bit more complicated. They use a system called GEARS, which is the Georgia Electronic Accident Reporting System, and we would basically have to get that data and incorporate it into ours and try to data match again, which we did do with, like I said, the EMS data, but it was very difficult to get them to share that data.
So, as this comes out to an overall standpoint of injury prevention, our initial hypothesis of trying to figure out, is it tourists, is it people at night that are drinking and alcohol? And while the data didn't necessarily support that, it kind of turns our head to a different approach and a different campaign. And I think that part of that comes from complacency. We do things off and on, throughout our lives that we get away with. Some people more often than others. Texting and driving is definitely one of them. I text and drive all the time and never get caught. It only takes that one time where you miss something, where you take your eyes off the road for too long for that accident to occur. We don't typically think of walking as a dangerous activity, but when you're walking in a city that you're used to and you're walking, I know where I'm going, I know the streets, people will stop for me. You walk with a different stature sometimes than if you were to walk in a city that you're not familiar with. And I think that that's probably what we learned from this, is that the tourism, a lot of them are pretty cautious about where they're going because they're not necessarily sure of where they're at. So the data showing, it mainly being 68% locals, and then students even more so, or school age, residents between under 30 years old. Those are the people that are a little bit more adventurous. Those are the people that like to reach and lean a little bit further on the ladder, and it only takes that one time you overreach till you fall.
So what we ended up doing from here is we did meet with our local traffic engineering folks, and we found out that the data they were using to make traffic engineering decisions was based on the GEARS data. So it was not including trauma registry data, and it was not including EMS data. So it was only when a police officer had been called to that incident. That data they were using was also 3 years old. And a lot has changed in Savannah in 3 years. So we brought our data to them and gave it to them to help make direct changes in their traffic engineering, such as sidewalks and crosswalks, that were based on where people are actually getting hurt and not necessarily where police officers are finding that. And I think that's really important as we move forward with projects like this. To kind of get the whole 360 view. One thing we did not get to capture because we did not have the police data was if it was car fault or pedestrian fault. And that is something we felt like would be really impactful to this study.
It's Tybee Island, even after this data, they've that main strip where the pedestrians were struck the most, kind of on their business, between the businesses and the beach, they've installed flashing lights at each of their crosswalks now, which has significantly decreased their incidents. We haven't had near the volume of calls that we used to out there. Another one that they did was the causeway to Tybee, where there were a couple incidents of pedestrians and more incidents of bicyclists struck. They brought that down from, it was a 2-lane and 1 lane in each direction. It would kind of flip-flop east and west, but they brought it down to just strictly a 2-lane road. So allowed for wider shoulders, better center lines, a little bit more of a buffer between the bicyclists or pedestrian traffic that may be going down that roadway.
Applications. I always say this is my favorite injury prevention project, even though it was a lot, because you can get real-time data and make direct changes to implement a prevention program. A lot of the programs that we do in registry with registry information or in trauma centers can be very vague. So if we're giving out car seats, we can look at 5 years down the road at child fatality and child injury rates. We could look at this information, implement something, and look at it the next month and see if it worked. We thought that was pretty neat. Most of the agencies were working on these engineering projects. Like we said, we're not utilizing a full set of data, so it was great to develop that relationship and share it. And it was very easy to measure, so we can measure it now, again, in probably a year, and we would also like to measure how things change with COVID a little bit. Some of the challenges, I know we're running out of time, like we said, data gathering, data sharing. It's interesting because while EMS reports their information to the state, and the trauma registry information goes to the state, and the police information goes to the state, that doesn't mean that everybody can access that. Turnover, it's really important to have someone who you can call. Like we said, our GQuip person had moved to Boston, and that was unfortunate for our program. And then elements that we were unable to capture, like distracted walking, pedestrian fall, that sort of thing.
And also knowing the intersections and the areas where we've had the most instances, that allows us to really have a better grip on the pulse of what's going on there. We're able to set alerts from an EMS standpoint anytime an incident occurs of that type in those areas, that it automatically notifies the registry team and the trauma team, so that they can continue to dig in and figure out if in real time, if it's something that a engineering control standpoint could help with, or if it was just another anomaly. So,
does anyone have any questions for us? If nobody has any or doesn't want to say anything now, we're happy to, we have our emails listed as well.
We actually do have a question. And I don't know if we just missed this, but I know you talked about drug and alcohol use in the pedestrian, the patient that got injured, but was there any way to check for alcohol or drug use in the driver?
Unless we can start to combine the data from the police reports with our incident reports, no, or unless the driver went to the hospital at the same time. So that was something we could kind of hand comb. If we had two patients come in at the same time and we had two EMS reports, we may have noticed it. But that is a large factor we are missing by not having the police reports.
And that's something from an EMS standpoint that we can do if we treat both patients. So if we treat the patient that was struck and the driver, we do have a master incident number and then each individual run number underneath of them. So that's something that we at the time didn't, our system wasn't set up that way to be able to pull in a group like that. But we can now pull it to where if any run number within a given incident includes vehicle versus pedestrian, we could pull both runs and then look at the specific information. So was one a driver and was one a pedestrian? As far as alcohol or drug use goes, from our standpoint, most of that is if the patient admits to it. We're not getting toxicology reports in the field, so it really does rely on the hospital data sets, or if the police performed a field sobriety test or something along those lines, which Stephanie said. We don't have that information to this day.
Yeah. One thing, as Luke said, that we are working towards is the state of Georgia had tried to form a long ID to match patients, and it wasn't super successful. And so we have, as a result of this research, have kind of worked on that a little bit more, and so far we are seeing some success in linking patients.
So how is the new the UUID, the unique universal unique patient identifier that's supposed to be coming out in the new NASEMSO version and hopefully linking EMS and trauma data? Are you anticipating that will be more useful to you?
I haven't had a chance to familiarize myself enough with it. We had been, as Stephanie was working on, our own kind of form of long ID, so taking the combination of patient first name, letters of their last name, date of the incident or date that they were brought to the hospital, linking that with their date of birth and some information from their social to generate an ID that I can pull out of our EMS data set. And ideally, if the information for the patient is put in correctly at the hospital, should match up, and they would be specific to date. There would be some anomalies, for the patient was struck by a vehicle at 11:45 p.m. and arrived at the hospital at 12:15 a.m. Obviously, we have a date mismatch there on the data service. But I am looking forward to, to having something official that will be a standard that we can pull and put into our systems that the hospitals will also have in theirs for that very purpose. Take it a step further, it would be great if we could get the police departments to include that information as well.
Yeah, if we could, as we kind of move down the road and see how it works, thankfully we have a lot of agencies that are very willing to try things. And so as we continue moving forward with this, it will be very interesting to see how that does work with linking our non-traditional units like our police and fire. But we are hoping that being able to attach patients will obviously make a lot of things easier, especially when you do not have one EMS service, or you may have patients going from one hospital to another hospital.
And that identifier too, Alyssa, that's something that if it's in our records and it's in the hospital records and it's in the registry records, when we talk about programs like ArcGIS and mapping, they can do all the math for you at that point. I can take a completely 3 independent data sets and join them based off of this unique identifier on all 3, and it will do the work for you. It'll group everything together. You can generate your geocode all your addresses using our incident address. Click on it, and it'll show you, their de-identified or identified data, and be able to see, their hospital outcomes, their registry scores from the trauma department. So it will be a whole different ballgame once that comes to fruition for us.
Absolutely. I know that has been kind of a goal for sure for a long time. And I know we have Dia on, or Kathy. I don't know if either of you could speak to the UUID more, but I know it was just brought up on the TQIP conference yesterday, and NASEMSO has been involved since 2016. We were involved in a kind of with ACS and NHTSA and a whole group of people, where we did make that recommendation that the UUID needed to come out and start with EMS and then continue on into the hospital. So it looks like that's maybe in the near future, or we're starting at least to get to that point, because I think we will have so much more interesting data like what you guys did, but hopefully it won't be as time consuming and intensive for you if we could just link this data together. So.
And overall, it speeds up the process too, from a standpoint, not just from looking at things retroactively, but in real time. And that's something that a lot of agencies, and ours included, up until years ago, it's my data. These are my patient records. You might find something in there you don't like and use it against us, but opening that up to your hospitals and working with your hospitals to where it's a consistent flow, and most recent, so our dispatchers put in information. The crew members in the field can pull that information from the dispatch software to do their report. So it saves them from having to put in the address and possibly mistyping it, putting in the times of the incident and possibly mistyping them. So that information gets into our system. From there, the hospitals have access currently to our data. They can pull up and view our reports, and the registry's office can pull up and view our reports. But the next step that we're looking at pursuing is a true hospital hub environment, where our data, as we're putting it in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, we'll be pushing to the hospital system that we're transporting to, so that can be integrated with theirs, so that UUID that we put in on our ePCR carries through automatically without having. And then it helps the nurses on the intake know what medications we gave, what we had when we got there. That is ultimate goal, but it's a slow process, and especially each state runs at their own pace.
Yes, we are all painfully aware of how different each of our states are, for sure. So I found it so interesting that 5 states make up half of the deaths, the peds versus auto deaths, and I noticed they were all warm states coming from one that's not.
Yeah,
I think you guys have people that get out and walk a lot more. In areas where there's vehicles, we have definitely in Montana a lot of outdoor users, but they're not typically getting hit by cars. So, well, thank you guys so much. I don't think we had any other questions from the group. I know, oh, there was a response. Elements of data that might be good to include would be traffic volumes in those hotspots, and see if there were changes in flow in those hotspots.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I would be working with the engineering departments to try to look at those on the specific dates. If there were road closures, parade routes, that kind of thing would be something we consider, but it's a little bit, again, it involves having a manual effort from someone to do that.
Thank y'all. And our emails are on the PowerPoint, so if you have any questions.
Yes, thank you so much for your time, and great information up. We are still getting a few more, so thank you, great presentation. And then Dia Gaynor, who is NASEMSO's our president, said about 2 weeks ago, she confirmed that the joint paper developed by the ACS-COT was cleared by NHTSA, and she checked with Holly, that would be Holly Michaels at ACS, about its release, but still haven't heard back. And it specifically illustrates how the UUID would work. So stay tuned. That is currently in the works as we So hopefully our data will start getting linked and we'll have some great research coming out of that. So
Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
and have a wonderful holiday season.
Thanks, everybody.